Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today we're returning to Ultimate General's Civil War, and we are looking at the Battle of Shiloh. Now, in our last video, we didn't really talk too much about the history, we just kind of started the Battle of Shiloh in the initial engagement. I believe it was on the left at Shiloh Church. But in this battle, we're moving on toward the right, toward the river, where the Confederates are attempting to attack the Union forces, drive them away from the river, into the swamps northwest of Pittsburgh Landing, where the Union headquarters was, and attempting to destroy them. This is part 7 of a Let's Play of the Union campaign as I'm playing through, and so far we've met with nothing but success in this series, although this is where the battles really start to get big and really start to get difficult. Now, 2 episodes ago, we provided some history and some background of the Battle of Shiloh, but I'm going to do a little bit more of a comprehensive history in this video and focus less on the gameplay. So the gameplay is there, you can certainly watch and enjoy. This is all taken from a live stream, but what I'm really going to be doing here is talking about history. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump in. In our last look at the history of the Civil War, we discussed the background for the Shiloh campaign. We talked about how the Confederacy came to have its thin and overextended defensive line established by Albert Sidney Johnston breached by the Union at the summer of 1862. Johnston's line, which ran west to east, was anchored at the fortress of Columbus, Kentucky, on the bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River. Its center was composed of 2 forts on the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers, Henry and Donaldson, respectively, and his right extended to Bowling Green, Kentucky, with lighter forces screening his right flank under General Zollicoffer. As you'll remember, last time we detailed how Albert Sidney Johnston's forces were flung back and his defensive line broken to disastrous effect in 1862. It started in January with the defeat and death of his commander on the right, Zollicoffer, at Mill Springs in eastern Kentucky. The result of that battle was the ejection of the Confederacy with its forces from eastern Kentucky. This, however, would have been manageable had General Ulysses S. Grant not completely shattered his center. In February, Grant first took the poorly sited and built fort on the Cumberland River called Henry, after a brief encounter. Then, shortly thereafter, the true disaster occurred on the Tennessee River at Fort Donaldson. At the Battle of Fort Donaldson, General Grant captured the main Confederate force in the center of its defensive line. Following a brief and sharp battle, the 16,171-man force at Donaldson was forced to surrender, almost in its entirety. The loss of Donaldson and Henry allowed the Union to travel gunboats down key arteries of invasion into central Tennessee. Johnston was forced to withdraw forces from Bowling Green and Columbus, Kentucky, lest they become flanked and destroyed by the Union forces now operating between them. Another Confederate force was bottled up at Island No. 10 on the Mississippi. The entire Confederate position was compromised, and so on February 25th, almost without firing a shot, Union troops entered the capital of Tennessee, Nashville, the first Confederate state capital to fall during the Civil War. Meanwhile, Albert Sidney Johnston's were rallying and concentrating in Corinth, Mississippi, further south, a key rail junction in northern Mississippi, just over the border from Tennessee. And rallying they needed to do. In just 2 months, the Confederates had been ejected from the vast swaths of Kentucky and Tennessee previously under their control. Nearly the entire portion of central and western Tennessee was now in Union hands. January and February of 1862 were unmitigated disasters for the Confederacy. Fortunately for the South, the Union was not prepared for such a triumph, and did not immediately follow up their successes. For the greater part of March, the Confederates concentrated in Corinth. Johnston sent telegram after telegram to the War Office in Richmond, pleading for more forces. He needed to rebuild his shattered army. He had lost almost 1/3 of his entire force, and he needed more men in order to rally his forces and be able to put up any substantial resistance. Fortunately, he didn't have to wait long. His friend, Confederate President Jefferson Davis, swiftly answered his calls for reinforcements. How did he do this? By stripping forces from the Gulf Coast. This stripping of the forces along the Gulf Coast would have disastrous consequences for the South, but that's another story for another time. Those weren't the only reinforcements Johnson was to get, however. Fresh off his embarrassing defeat at Pea Ridge in northwest Arkansas, the flamboyant yet useless Confederate general Earl Van Dorn was ordered to Corinth with his 15,000 troops. Yet, in this task, as with his task to defend Arkansas, Dorn would provide yet another impressive disappointment, by failing to even show up in time for the battle which would become the largest and most significant stand-up engagement in the Western theater until Chickamauga, more than a year later. Johnson thus concentrated, or was preparing to concentrate, an army of over 55,000 men at Corinth, in a force he dubbed the Army of Mississippi. While Johnston was on the way to join his forces there, General Ulysses S. Grant's army of 6 federal divisions, known as the Army of Tennessee, was unloading from transports a mere 20 miles away at Pittsburg Landing. Grant's troops began unloading on March 14, 1862, and this presented an opportunity to the Confederacy and Johnston, because Grant's forces were isolated on the west bank of the Tennessee River, without support from other Union forces. This meant the Confederates could strike at a roughly equal enemy force operating in hostile territory and with its back to the river, a golden opportunity as Johnston saw it. Johnson didn't join his army, however, in Corinth till March 24th. When he did, however, the concentration of his forces was already well underway, under the direction of his second-in-command, the hero of Fort Sumter and Bull Run, Pierre Touton Gustave Beauregard. The Creole had been dispatched to the west after being unable to get along with the massive personalities operating in the east, and thus he was shuffled out of sight and out of mind to act as the second-in-command of Albert Sidney Johnston's army. Beauregard's story, however, is a story for another time. While Johnston was making his way to Corinth, it's worth noting that PGT was skillfully arranging the army for him. Upon arriving in Corinth, Johnston began receiving good intelligence on the makeup and location of Grant's army at Pittsburg Landing. He immediately saw the opportunity which awaited him. Grant, for that matter, wasn't even in command or in charge of his forces when they landed. He had been removed temporarily by General Henry Halleck, his direct superior, following his victory at Donaldson. Some claim it was due to accusations that Grant was drunk during the near-disastrous Confederate counterattack. There are others who claim it was due to the jealousy of Halleck as a result of his subordinates' tremendous fame, thanks to his victories at Henry and Donaldson. The moniker Unconditional Surrender Grant made him a household name, whereas Halleck didn't get the same treatment. In any case, Grant returned to his forces and resumed command in late March of 1862. Grant's army at Pittsburg Landing consisted of 6 divisions, some 42,000 men, but only 5 were on the west bank of the Tennessee River, while his 6th division was on the wrong side of the river and almost 9 miles upstream. Thus, at Pittsburg Landing, Grant's forces were something less than 42,000 men, and they were widely scattered. His division commanders were Pretense, Sherman, Hurlbust, Lew Wallace, W.H.L. Wallace, and McClernand. Lew Wallace's division was the one located north, and thus isolated from the rest of his army at the start of the battle. The Confederate forces were divided up into 4 corps, really 5, but only 4 would take part. There was a 10,000-man force under General Leonidas Polk, a 16,000-man force under General Braxton Bragg, 7,000 men under William Hardee, and 7,000 more under General Breckinridge. Additionally, Earl Van Dorn would have an additional 15,000 men in a 5th Corps if he had arrived, which obviously, as I've already mentioned, he did not. Johnston spent the better part of the late half of March drilling and training his forces, who had all now arrived, some 40,000 men. He was waiting for General Earl Van Dorn's troops, the veterans of Pea Ridge, to arrive, but they had not yet come when on April 2nd he received word that General Buell's army was on the march. I haven't gotten to that yet, but General Buell commanded the Army of Ohio and was located in Nashville, moving west to join Grant. Grant's force at Pittsburgh Landing was sitting and waiting for Buell to link up, and then they would advance on Corinth jointly. That's why time was of the essence to the Confederacy, because while they had a near numerical parity with Grant, when Buell arrived, the numbers would be changed decisively in the Union's favor. Some 18,000 men were on the way to join Grant. However, intelligence claimed 30,000 men, and so the Confederates thought they were about to be dramatically outnumbered. As a result, both Pierre Touton Beauregard and General Braxton Bragg, the chief of staff for General Albert Sidney Johnston, both concluded that an attack would be necessary if the Confederacy was going to have any chance of obtaining a victory. And so, late in the night of April 2nd, early morning April 3rd, General Johnston made the order to have his corps advance. He sent orders to all 4 corps commanders to have their troops ready to move by 6 in the morning, even though Van Dorn hadn't arrived. However, things quickly started going awry. He had to assemble a council of war, tell his commanders what they were to do, and thus no forces began moving before 10 a.m. on April 3rd. When they did start moving, some 40,000 men, 40,300 men, began marching toward the Union force at Pittsburgh Landing, some 20 miles away. They cooked 3 days of rations. The Confederate forces consisted of some 16 brigades and 71 regiments. And the force had what they thought was only a one-day march to the Union Army. The Union Army, meanwhile, was spread out in 6 different divisions and 6 different camps, all in the general vicinity of Pittsburgh Landing. Grant, as we said earlier, had about 42,000 soldiers in his 6 divisions, but if we remember from earlier, one of those divisions was on the wrong side of the river and about 10 miles upstream. That meant that when Johnston's army arrived, Grant would only have 5 divisions to face him and something less than 42,000 men. As a result, Grant would be at a severe numerical disadvantage at the initial point of contact. Further off, Grant's 5 divisions were not deployed in any sort of uniform defensive position, but were just sort of haphazardly thrown around some empty fields and some clearings. Additionally, the troops were not dug in. C.F. Smith, who had commanded the army during Grant's temporary reassignment, had decided not to dig in, and Grant conceded to that decision. Perhaps it was a fear that it would decrease Union morale, or it was just Union hubris that the expectation was to advance and not to receive an enemy attack. Either way, despite the fact that they were occupying heavily defensible terrain, the Union made the decision not to dig in, not to set their forces up in any sort of defensive position, and they were widely separated, dispersed, and not uniform. This meant that when a surprise attack would come at Shiloh, the Union was in almost the worst possible position, barring being separated by all other divisions by dozens of miles, for being able to support each other and put up an effective resistance. The Confederate Army, as we've already said, started marching out on April 6. The distance was only 20 miles, and Johnston believed that he'd be able to attack by the 3rd. However, heavy rains delayed the Confederate attack by more than 48 hours. Additionally, Confederate troops ran into Union skirmishers and fought several small actions against these Union pickets. Several Union regimental commanders expressed concern that the Confederates were approaching and tried to raise the alarm, but their concerns were disregarded by both General Sherman and General Grant, Sherman commanding one of Grant's divisions. General P.G.T. Beauregard, the second in command of the Confederate force, believed that due to these skirmishes the element of surprise had been lost. Furthermore, Johnston's largely green army had experienced a very poor showing along the march. They exercised extremely poor noise discipline, often clearing weapons by firing them, despite the fact that the communication they received from their officers was the need for utmost secrecy and quiet. Despite all of this, somehow, the Union did not become aware of the Confederate advance at the high command, and as a result, the Union Army was still largely unprepared for a Confederate attack as of the early morning hours of April 6. The heavy rains relented, and the Confederates poised themselves for an attack on April 6. As I've said before, the plan was to sweep the Union Army away from the river, attack along a wide front, across the entire Union front, advance more swiftly along the Confederate right, the Union left, which was along the Tennessee River, swing the Union Army left away from the river, drive them into the swamps north of Pittsburgh Landing, where they could be destroyed away from any support or possible reinforcements coming down the river. Things would not quite develop that way, but that's what we'll discuss next. Now, let's go ahead and jump into the actual battle. 3 a.m., April 6, 1862. The Battle of Shiloh begins. At around 3 a.m. on April 6, 1862, Colonel Everett Peabody, commanding the 1st Brigade of Brigadier General Benjamin Prentice's division, sent a patrol of 3 companies of infantry, about 250 men from the 25th Missouri Regiment and 12th Michigan, on a recon to basically just take a look at the area in front of Pretence's division. As we've mentioned, Prentence was one of Grant's 6 division commanders. Now, for the past several days, the Confederates had actually been skirmishing very lightly, pot shots here and there that had been fired back and forth between the 2 lines. The senior commanders in Grant's army weren't all that troubled by this. They didn't believe the Confederates were going to launch an attack. Sherman had brushed off numerous reports from a somewhat terrified colonel, I believe, of an Ohio regiment. And so there were signs the Confederates were amassing, but they were being ignored. Now, one of the reasons those signs of evidence were being ignored was confirmation bias. The Union generals didn't think the Confederates would attack them, for one reason or another. On the other side, it was also because Grant had more or less ordered them to. Grant had issued orders that basically said, I don't, under any circumstances, want to get involved in in a battle here until General Buell's army comes up. So essentially, by doing that, his subordinates didn't send out pickets, didn't send out scouts or screens or anything like that. They didn't set up patrols, vedettes, or basically blockhouses. They didn't do anything really to defend against a potential surprise attack by the Confederates. The rationale for this was that if they were to send troops out, they would be more likely to engage the Confederates and draw them into a battle that the Union did not want to fight until after Grant and Buell had linked up and the Union had overwhelming forces. As a result, the Union knew very little about what was going on. With that being said, there had been shooting that had been occurring between the 2 armies. We mentioned earlier how when the Confederates were coming up, they were not exactly exercising good discipline. And actually, there had been a few cavalry skirmishes, pot shots occurring various days. And so, this had all been occurring all without the Northern troops becoming at least their senior commanders, without them becoming worried. Colonel Peabody was a little bit concerned. He thought the Confederates may be massing for an attack, and so he sent this patrol out on the early morning hours of April 6, 1862. Now, imagine this. You wake up at 3 in the morning under orders from your company to go on a patrol in the morning. Half asleep, you're stumbling through the woods, and you start receiving some occasional fire from an enemy formation. You guys think it's just enemy scouts or enemy pickets, so you attack with zeal. You and your men line up side by side and charge the enemy's skirmishers back through the woods. You drive them back. It seems as if you're winning. The enemy is running. Obviously, this was just a small skirmish. And then you top a small rise in the woods, a heavily wooded area, toward a swamp. And what do you see? More than 9,000 Confederates marching right at you. They quickly overwhelm you. You turn tail and run. And obviously at this point something big is about to happen. Prentence at first complained to Peabody. He was outraged that he had sent forward such a strong skirmishing force. He believed the initial firing was a result of his colonel's disobedience of orders to not provoke a general engagement, and he thought he was going to bring on a larger engagement because of his actions, at least until he saw the tens of thousands of Confederates lining up and charging his positions. At that point, he probably realized, no 250 men is going to provoke an attack of this size. However, the skirmishing effort, or the patrol, did serve its purpose. It gave Pretence's forces it might be Prentice's forces. I'm always bad with pronunciation. It gave Prentice's forces a warning that the enemy was coming, and they were among the only troops that really had any serious warning. Prentice's forces were able to form up into good order and be able to receive the initial attack, which he was attacked by General Bragg's corps coming up, and then Breckinridge would end up deploying to Bragg's right and up and around him. At the end of the day, the Confederates deployed 4 corps all along the front, but they actually had sort of a different initial setup of the army. It was a little bit confused, but as the army came up, it formed into battle line with both Bragg and Hardee in front. I believe Hardee was actually the lead unit. And then behind them were Polk and Breckinridge on the flanks, who would feed reserves in as necessary. This meant that the Confederates, in theory, would have substantial reinforcements to deploy and allow them to take the enemy by surprise, and then if they did run into heavy resistance, it would allow them to overcome it. Breckinridge did deploy in this way. Bragg and Hardee were deployed up front, Polk sent some forces in between them, and then Breckinridge deployed on Bragg's left to try and outflank some of Pretence's forces as his forces began to resist strongly against the Union. The problem was, in order for Johnston's plan to work, and for Johnson to sweep the Union away from the river and into the swamps to the northwest, his right flank had to move more quickly than his left, and there was no real means made to support this sort of an attack. Prentice's forces were further toward the right, along with General Wallace's division, but Prentice's forces were more on the right side of the Union line, well, Union left, Confederate right, and they were well put into position and ready to receive the attack. Sherman's division, and Sherman, by the way, was actually in command of the camp by defact. Grant was not actually on site at the outbreak of the battle. But Sherman was actually on the left, and Sherman was caught much more by surprise. The colonel he had been scolding for basically being a baby and being a sissy and worried about everything, once again raised the alarm. He didn't believe him. No serious efforts were made to resist the enemy, and as a result, the Union left was pushed back with ease and quickly. Sherman would end up rallying just behind what we now know as the Shiloh Church, again with General McClernand's division coming up alongside him and forming up and beginning to put together some resistance, which would eventually be overwhelmed. But at the end of the day, the Union right, or the Confederate left, fled with much less of a fight that they put up, while the Union left, the Confederate right, was where all the real major resistance happened early on, with the Hornets' Nest and Prentice's forces being turned out and receiving the Confederate forces. Additionally, command and control on the Confederate side was poor, to say the least. General Albert Sidney Johnston moved forward with his troops and led from the front, which, while noble and I'm sure many, enlisted men probably thought very highly of the general, meant that he lacked overall command of the attack, which ended up more or less devolving to General Pierre Toutant Beauregard. Beauregard, remember, was the one who believed they had lost surprise against the Union and didn't want to attack. Actually, on the night of April 5th, he wanted to attack, but Johnston turned him down and said they'd attack in the morning. And again, Beauregard was concerned that the Confederates had given away their positions. He was concerned that Buell was edging ever closer and closer, and he now believed that an attack was folly. Now he was the one in charge of directing the attack, with Johnston in the front and General Pierre Toutant Beauregard in the rear, basically giving orders to the corps commanders on where they would move and how they would attack. And so the major attack began at 6 in the morning on April 6th. The Union right, or the Confederate left, gave way first, with Sherman and McClernand being pushed back. Prentice's forces were initially pushed back and then formed up on the Hornets' Nest, where they would end up resisting for some 10 hours against attack after attack by Confederate forces. Eventually, the Union were driven back. General Wallace's division, which was on the far right, or the far Union left, was driven back. Elements of Prentice's forces were cut off, and he was forced to surrender after a valiant effort at resisting the Union forces. Nonetheless, enough time had been bought by all the forces involved, who fought more well than we would often think when it comes to the Battle of Shiloh, where so often we think of Shiloh as being an absolute surprise, and the Confederates not having much resistance outside of the Hornets' Nest. That was not the case. The Union actually fought pretty well and ended up being driven back over the course of the day. The Confederates were attacking an enemy that was growing stronger and stronger. By 5 p.m. that night, General Lew Wallace's division, I mentioned another Wallace, that was W.H.L. Wallace. Lew Wallace's division arrived around 5 p.m. General Nelson's division arrived around 7 p.m., and elements of Buell's army began pouring in after that. Before the battle was up, some 18,000 men under General Buell would arrive, and again, more troops under General Lew Wallace, which arrived that evening, meant that by the end of the battle, the Union would outnumber the Confederates' starting strength by some 20,000 men, about 63,000 Union troops versus 40,000 Confederates. When the fighting started, the Union had fewer than 44,000 men against 40,000 Confederates. They probably had somewhere in the range of the mid to upper 30s, thanks to the division being detached under Wallace further north. There was a bit of controversy that developed because Lew Wallace's division, that was on the wrong side of the river and 10 miles north by design, ended up taking so long to arrive. All he had was 10 miles to cover, and yet he didn't cover it adequately. He didn't show up until, late in the evening on April 6th of 1862. He would end up being relieved of his command, and I don't know if it was only because of this, but when Halleck reorganized the army at the end of April, Wallace was left without a command. And after sort of more information came out about Shiloh, his basically career took a huge nosedive, and he would never really recover as far as his reputation is concerned. And so that's how Shiloh developed, and at least for the first day of fighting. The second day of fighting we will discuss in our next video, but in general, the Union was somewhat surprised. They should not have been. They had plenty of warning. The Confederates had been skirmishing with them for days. They knew there were Confederate forces in the area. They were getting reports from their junior officers that there were Confederate forces in the area, and yet they didn't listen. And in this scenario, an ultimate general, the battle does a good job of kind of treating you to that initial surprise, but also giving the Union adequate time to form up and resist, as in most cases after the initial shock of the Confederate advance, they did. In my case, I'm doing far better than the historic Union Army did. I've held Shiloh Church. The enemy isn't really threatening the Hornet's Nest, which is kind of on the top right of the map, as you'll see. The Hornet's Nest was this defensible position with a sunken road and good trees, all with somewhat of an orchard overlooking the approaches, and it was something that resisted for quite some time. I believe this was actually the area where General Albert Sidney Johnston was killed, so I didn't mention that, but attack after attack after attack were failing near some peach orchards, near the Hornet's Nest, and Johnston, in an effort to spur his men to greater efforts, to greater success, he was always in the front, leading attacks throughout the day. There is no doubt that he was personally very brave and was inspiring his troops from the front, even if he wasn't commanding their tactical dispositions. However, it's safe to say that he somewhat botched the plans and the attack and didn't do a very good job of ensuring a clear and cohesive strategy. And as a result, he was disconnected from the main fighting of the battle, which was fought by PGT Beauregard. In his case, he led an attack through a peach orchard where bullets were zipping around, hitting these peaches that was causing these blooming peaches, flower petals to fall down almost as if it was snowing. He had led a successful attack against some Union forces in this peach orchard. He was riding back with his staff, and at some point in time he got hit in the leg, actually I believe it was in the boot, with a mini ball, and it punctured, I don't know if it's the femoral artery, but the major artery in the leg, and he ended up bleeding to death very quickly. He could have been saved, but alas, he had sent his personal physician away to help aid some wounded prisoners, I believe it was, and take care of them, so his personal physician was not on scene. A tourniquet was not properly applied in adequate timing, and as a result, the Confederates lost one of the commanders they considered one of their greatest assets, in spite of him somewhat bungling the Kentucky and Tennessee campaign, and bungling quite a bit with regards to the Shiloh campaign as well. And so we'll detail more how the attacks went in the next video, specifically the afternoon attacks. We've kind of mentioned there was a bit of a surprise early on at the beginning of the battle. The Union was pushed back. Sherman and W.H.L. Wallace on the left were thrown back. Pretense held out near the Hornet's Nest for quite some time, putting up some stiff resistance and making the Confederates buy some of that territory dearly for more than 10 hours before eventually being surrounded and destroyed. And the Union troops retreated north to Pittsburgh Landing. We'll set this up a little bit for the second day's fighting in the next video, but that at a high level is how the Battle of Shiloh unfolded. With all that being said, we're right around the 30-minute mark, guys, so I'm going to go ahead and cut this video off here. I hope you enjoyed. Let me know your thoughts below. And next time we'll talk more about the later part of the battle, how things unfolded, what happened at the end of the fight, more about Buell arriving on the field, and we'll all go from there. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know your thoughts below. And until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and I'm out.